John. It's good to see you.
Hey, Sean, good seeing you. How are you doing?
I am great. Thank you. What
Good.
is on your mind this week?
Okay, so I read a study that I want to tell you about, but it's interesting because it ties into a what's on your mind section from an earlier episode. So I'm trying to tie those together a little bit.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, so we've talked about this is even in a different episode. We've talked about different the brain process in different locations and what the brain does in different areas of the brain, and we've talked about where speech originates, and that's in Broca's area. If you remember, we talked
Mm-hmm.
about being on the left side of the brain, and so a medical doctor by the name of Paul Broca discovered it. This was 160 years ago. I knew it had been a long time. I knew it had been well over 100 years, but the article I was reading said it was 160 years ago
Wow.
that Paul Broca discovered this area because he had patients that couldn't produce speech. They could write stuff down, so they had fluent thought. They just couldn't produce the speech. They couldn't say it. They struggled with that. So that became known as Broca's area. He had several patients with that issue, and they all had damage to the same area of the brain, kind of in the left hemisphere. So that became known as Broca's area. And then Broca's aphasia means, aphasia is the inability to do something. So Broca's aphasia was the inability to speak. Um,
Hmm.
Researchers just found another area, and actually they found out that Broca's area isn't the area that produces speech. It's another area of the brain, and this is out of the University of California, San Francisco. They found that Broca's area is involved initially in like planning speech, but producing the speech is another area. So if you remember, we talked about the brain, how it's wrinkly.
Mm-hmm.
So the wrinkles, the very kind of the top ridge of a wrinkle is called a gyrus, or gyri is plural, and the deep valley is a sulcus, or sulci for plural. And right in the middle, kind of the central sulcus, is a divider right in the middle that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And on the first bump behind that is a somatosensory cortex that processes feelings like touch over the body. Remember, there's a map, like you can touch your hand and your face when we were talking about phantom limbs.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
the post central gyrus, and then the precentral gyrus is the motor cortex, where how you produce motions and movements throughout the body.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the groove below that, the valley, is the precentral. Uh, there's a valley there, and then the next bump is the precentral gyrus. So it sits right in front of the motor cortex, and in the center of that is where speech is actually produced. So it's called the central precentral gyrus, or the middle precentral gyrus. So it's right in the middle, and we thought it was Broca's area for 160 years, but now research is showing it's actually this middle precentral gyrus that is producing speech. So I think a good way to think about it is that the like you have these thoughts going through your mind, and when you decide you want to talk about them or say something about them, the Broca's area in the frontal lobe gathers those thoughts together and creates a plan for what you want to say. So if somebody's talking about like eating turkey, for example, and you want to say, I don't like turkey that much. I only eat it at Thanksgiving because it's Thanksgiving, so I eat it then, but I don't care for it otherwise. It's Broca's area that puts that plan together to say, I only eat turkey at Thanksgiving. But you have those thoughts, and then Broca's area decides what you want to say. Then that information, it passes to the middle precentral gyrus, and it creates the plan for the motor cortex for all the movements and the timing of the movements to move your mouth and your tongue and all of the air, your lungs for the air to create the speech sounds is in a different area. So I guess another way to say this was originally it was thought that Broca's area was like the construction site. So you're going to build a building, Broca's area built it. But now we're learning that Broca's area is more like the architect that then sends the plans, and the construction crew is this middle precentral gyrus area that then builds the speech speech patterns. And how that I thought that was interesting that it's been, we've talked about science and how you can't always be sure. You can't say with certainty that we have discovered exactly how this works because there's always new discoveries. So Broca's area plays a role in speech production, but it's not the final step like we thought. And that's why science has to be ongoing and continuous. But it ties back into, not long ago, I talked about how they're using AI, they're recording brain activity and using AI to start predicting what you're thinking. And you can actually, they were kind of producing speech based on their thoughts. And one of the problems of that, we said at the time, was how do you know, like, there are thoughts that go through your mind that you aren't consciously producing. And sometimes there are thoughts that you think, whoa, why did I think that? I sure don't want anybody else to know I just thought that. And if your brain's connected to a speaker output that starts speaking your thoughts, that could be bad. And
No, thank you.
Yeah, no,
I don't want that.
So now that they even mentioned in this article, now that they've located where purposeful speech originates, then that's the area that can be measured for AI to determine what your thoughts are, because this is what you're wanting to say rather than just random thoughts going through your mind. So it kind of solves that issue. So that's tying it back into what we said earlier about how will we, this technology could be really disruptive if you start, if you start blaring out everybody's thoughts, but now you can kind of confine it to an area that is what they're wanting, what a person is wanting to say is what could be produced.
Right. The plan's been made. It's been pushed. So a couple of things. I find it interesting that this new area that you're describing is closely located to the motor cortex.
Yeah, right.
And you already mentioned this, but the idea of like to say something, that there's muscles in my face, my mouth, my lips, my tongue. All of these things kind of have to coordinate together to produce certain sounds and certain words. And so like a really good example is if you ever have learned to speak Spanish or you speak Spanish, rolling your R's is something we don't do in English, but it's a different motor movement that can be taught, but that you have to learn in order to produce certain words in the Spanish language. And I'm saying that as an extreme example to say, like, everything, every sound, every word we produce in English also requires these fine motor movements in those areas to produce that. But I had a dip, so that was really fascinating. We're not even 10 minutes in, and I'm fascinated by that. But we've talked in the past about the difference between the on channel and the back channel. And one of the
describe
things,
those real quick.
So you're the back channel being this non-conscious part of your brain that runs a large majority of your life, your day, but it's happening in a way that we're not necessarily aware of. It's going on, and again, just kind of running in the background. And then it pushes forward, drives, instincts, habits, all of these things. And then the on channel is the main job is to kind of monitor the back channel. And I'm going to bring it right to kind of my question though, is because we've also established my back channel's a jerk. If left unchecked, would say and do stupid things that would get me in a lot of trouble, have a lot of people angry at me, and all of that. My back channel is just here for the party with no thought of consequences. My on channel, then, the job is to kind of go, and specifically to speech. The example you've used before, I've heard it, you use it a lot, is you're sitting in a meeting and you have this urge to say something, and it kind of bubbles up from the back channel, and your on channel goes, don't say that. That's gonna, whatever it is, it's gonna embarrass you, it's gonna make someone angry, it's gonna hurt someone's feelings, whatever, don't say that. But I've had that happen, but I've also had, for whatever reason, my on channel just kind of asleep at the wheel, and I blurt out that stupid thing. Right. And so I said all of that to say, Now that we're talking about the connection between the architect who's putting all of that together, and then the actual message, coming from that area, that different area, forming all of the motor movement for me to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I'm now thinking about, like, when you jam all that together, where does the on channel, I want, this is more rhetorical, I'm just wondering, like, where does the on channel get involved with that, so that I don't say that thing? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I was asking you to explain on channel and back channel for new listeners, because I think it's important if there's anybody listening or missed one of our episodes where we were talking about it. But that's the important part. And uh, I want to be really careful, because I don't want to overgeneralize, because the brain is so complex, and it does so many things. There's so much stuff going on all at one time. So you can never really narrow it down to one area anyway. But the prefrontal cortex kind of embodies the on-channel idea. That's your conscious awareness. That's the one that's always trying to control the rest of the brain, control urges and impulses. It sends signals to the amygdala. It sends it to the motor cortices, and just other, it kind of tries to control things. So it's in the prefrontal cortex. Broca's area is in the frontal cortex, and the middle precentral gyrus is in the frontal cortex. So those are all areas in the frontal cortex. The prefrontal is just one, like behind your forehead. It's even more forward than the other parts that are a little bit further back, like closer to your ear and the top of your head. And the prefrontal is like right up in the front. But those thoughts and those ideas that bubble up come largely from the parietal and the temporal lobes. And so those are the thoughts, like the back channel. I mean, it kind of almost separates out, and I want to be careful with that, because that's not complete. There can be some of those areas can help process conscious awareness too, but they're largely the non-conscious systems in those areas. They push those forward to Broca. Broca's going to create the plan to say it and send it on, and at somewhere the prefrontal cortex is sending inhibitory. It has connections with so many different parts of the brain, so it can inhibit that middle prefrontal gyrus area, so that even after you have the plan, you can still disrupt it or stop it.
Thank goodness for that, because
But if you're right, when you said you're asleep at the wheel, that's right, because if your attention is on something else, then the prefrontal cortex isn't monitoring it, and things slip through. You have to kind of
blurt out that thing you instantly regret.
Yeah.
But I find myself, I have thoughts throughout the day. I wouldn't say a lot of thoughts, but I notice these thoughts where I go, where did that come from? What? No. Stop that, or whatever. And I just imagine if I'm blurting those things out throughout the day, just how disastrous from a social standpoint that would be for me. But and the other thing I'll say to you, maybe not an apology, but I mean, my goal on this podcast is always to try to bring these things down to a lay person, for me. And sometimes when I try to not force you to do it, but sometimes when I try to get you to do that, it can lead you to overgeneralize things. Yeah. So there is a balance that I want to recognize, that, there's this line that you have to walk where you know all of these things, but if you tried to explain it, it would take 8 hours for you to explain this one thing. And I'm asking you to do it in a 5-minute clip of just give me the highlights. So I do acknowledge that sometimes that I take it too far. So I appreciate you walking that line.
Yeah, I think it's good though to generalize. It makes it so much easier to understand, because you don't need to know everything that's going on if you get the general idea of what's going on. And so I want to do that part. I think that's necessary. It's not that I'm worried that, somebody more knowledgeable, which would be a lot of people, would say, well, actually, he's leaving out this, that, and the other. I mean, if people say it, that's okay, because I've had people ask me questions and I say, hey, I understand that, and we're generalizing. It's more, I try to keep it in kind of in perspective of how complicated things are, for the listener to not
Yeah.
think, oh, it's just this one area of the brain that does this. It's, and I told the story before about when I was learning in undergraduate about the brain and behavior and thought I understood everything, just like a neuron, that neurons always have an axon and there's always a gap at the synaptic connection when they communicate. And then I get to graduate school and find out, well, yeah, I mean, almost all the time, that there are neurons without axons. I'm going, wait, no, that breaks a rule that I had set hard in my mind. And, sometimes they're hardwired. There's no synaptic, gap. And I'm like, no, that can't be. So it's kind of that disappointment that, like, I thought everything was really cut and dry. So I just want to keep reminding the listeners that
Yeah.
it's so complex. And when I say one thing, there's probably rules that change it. So I just want to keep that nuance there. But I think it's really good to generalize, and I want to keep generalizing. So keep pushing me to do that more, because I think that makes it more understandable and relatable.
Challenge accepted. So, I mean, this is a great, well, not a great segue, but maybe the perfect segue, because I had a question. I was thinking about, we've talked about on the podcast before, trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, or some other things, but I was, and I don't even know where this came from, to be honest. Usually I have some genesis or some story of where it came from, but it was just, I was wondering about trauma and its actual effect on the brain, meaning, um, trying to tie this together in a very like succinct way, but are there physical changes in the brain, or is it a rewiring issue? Like, do you understand my question at the onset? Is like,
I
what is
do.
trauma's physical effect on that thing that's sitting in liquid underneath the
Mhm.
cranium here?
Yeah, yeah. Um, yes, there are changes, and you probably want more of an answer than that, because the
I
answer
would
is yes.
appreciate it. Yeah, yeah.
But I think so. It's, what's the first question would be why? So why would there be changes? Why can't we just experience trauma and then move on? So why would it
Yes.
be important for there to change? And then how long lasting are those changes? And so the answer to the first part is there needs to be changes, because if there's trauma in your life, whatever caused that trauma, your brain doesn't want to go through that trauma again. It wants to keep you from that trauma. So if there's something it can do to avoid going through a traumatic event again, then it's going to try to avoid that. So that's where changes come in, and there's rewiring issues. There can be structural changes in the brain. There, like, even like the hippocampus, which consolidates memories. It
Hmm.
can even change in size. Like, the volume of the hippocampus can change based on trauma. So there can be some major changes in the brain. So why would the brain do that? And the answer is to try to avoid that type of trauma. And then how long lasting is it? That kind of depends on the individual. It depends on your life experiences, your genetics, because trauma can also change your gene expression and your genetics, and you can pass that trauma on genetically to offspring. It's called epigenetics. So it can be long lasting, um, but for some people, it's longer lasting than for other people. Some people can bounce back from trauma more quickly than other people, and that's, we term that resilience.
Hmm.
And so I think it depends on, your genetics for one thing, and also your kind of your personal characteristics and makeup, and your life experiences, your support system. There's a lot that goes into it.
So I just realized, as so often when you're speaking, that there's at least two different kinds of trauma: acute trauma, which, like, something really bad happens once, kind of, just
Mm-hmm.
happens. And then there's chronic
Mm-hmm.
trauma, where I'm like traumatized over and over and over again.
Yep.
And so I'm assuming that those two different things affect the brain differently as well,
Y-
or no?
yes. Yeah. No, they do. So it's though. they affect it differently in like the volume of the effect. So some of the same systems that respond to trauma respond to acute trauma and persistent trauma or chronic trauma, but it's just, one is just repeated over and over. But why don't we do this to help understand it better? Why don't I give you an example
I
of
love
a
examples.
traumatic experience, and then talk about what's happening in the brain
Okay,
during that
that's
trauma?
helpful.
Because one
Helpful.
thing is just kind of off the start in general, people think, oh, I like with PTSD or with where you have flashbacks and things and memory, like I can't get rid of this memory. I think I even mentioned Schachter's book one time, that he said one of the the seven sins of memory, and one of the sins was forgetting. And it was, you think, well, that's because you forget things and that's frustrating. And there's also a part of memory where he said that, what's even worse is when you can't forget something. You're always remembering, and that's kind of the trauma side. You can't forget the memory, and so you're reliving the trauma. And so there's the idea that you have this memory. If I could just get rid of the memory, then I would get rid of that trauma and that feeling. But I want to change. I want you to start thinking about it differently than it being a memory, because we have in our minds, our on channel or conscious awareness, trying to understand and process things. It always wants to know why, how things work, and why. It's curious about those types of things. So it wants to take something that the brain does and compare it to something we know about, like a filing set. Like memories are like stored away in a file cabinet, because I can print something out or write something or draw it and go put it in a file cabinet and go get it later. And that sounds like a memory.
Mm-hmm.
Like just open the drawer and pull it out and there's your memory. But that's not how memory works. And so when we think about trauma, it's almost like, well, just lock that file drawer and don't ever let that trauma back
Right.
out. And that's not how it works. So I want to change the way you think about trauma and how the brain processes it, because there's a better way to understand it. And then it makes sense of why trauma is long lasting. And it also makes sense on how you can treat trauma. So let's start with an example. So since you talked about like acute trauma, like one traumatic event versus, trauma that occurs over and over. Let's talk about that one traumatic event, maybe a car wreck.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Were you thinking of a car wreck?
Yeah,
Okay.
when I said acute, I was like a vehicle collision, a car
Yeah,
wreck.
yeah. So vehicle
Yeah.
collision. So let's say that you're driving. Well, let's just say that uh, I'll just what can I whose name can I come up with? Mary. Let's just say Mary is driving a car, and let's say it's at night, so it's dark out and it's raining, so the road's a little bit slick, and she has her windows down, and she's not driving real fast. She's in town, let's say, or no, let's say she's on the highway. Let's say she's on the highway, and as she's driving, it's kind of dark, but she has her windows down. She's singing. There's music playing, and all of a sudden, a truck coming at her starts to cross that center line right before it gets to her, and she slams on her brakes. The car starts to slide, but there's, the truck hits her. There's an impact that throws her sideways. There's metal crunching, glass shattering. There's headlights right in her face, and everything goes black for a few seconds. She blacks out. She starts gaining awareness. She's trembling. She can feel her heart racing, and she's like trying to breathe, and she can hear sirens maybe in the background wailing, and just all of this trauma. That's a traumatic event that she just lived through. So if you look at what's happening in the brain at that moment, before she even realizes that truck is crossing the center line, her amygdala has probably picked that up, or her threat response system, and it jump starts her system and activates it before she's even aware of what's happening, because that's the fast system that operates really quickly to try to protect you. We talk about it when we talk about on channel, back channel. The brain's like an iceberg. It's like her brain gets pulled underwater. The water level goes way up. Now her back channel is in control, and that's the amygdala. There's an immediate dump of adrenaline into her system. The hypothalamus becomes really active, and the HPA axis and the system. These are all threat systems. Her blood pressure rises. cortisol, which is a stress hormone, spikes, and all of her sensory systems, like visual, auditory, olfactory, which is smell, all of these become really heightened, and they start recording all of the high intensity information they're experiencing, like the bright headlights, the screeching, so the really loud sounds, the smell of maybe the chemicals when a car smash of the antifreeze or whatever, those strong chemical smells. All of those get, it's like screenshot, like get frozen in time and tagged, labeled as life threatening. And the prefrontal cortex, it usually tries to slow all of this down. It's basically offline because it's underwater at this point, because it's extreme stress. And so things like language, reasoning, logic, all of that stuff is not working. It's all suppressed. None of that's working right now. So Mary can't form that coherent narrative memory of, I'm riding in my car, I see a truck crossing the line, this starts to happen, that starts to happen, because she can't put the narrative together because the on channel is underwater. So the hippocampus, which normally helps store that narrative memory so that you know the order of events and you can remember details about things, all it's encoding now are those snapshots of sensory. They're just fragmented sensory bound pieces of information. And that's all. It's like just a smell, a flash of light, the tension in your body. Those are the things that are getting stored as memory. So memory becomes really fragmented. And a lot of times people don't remember much about a traumatic event. They can't, even later, they can't remember really what happened. They start kind of trying to piece things together. And a lot of times it's based on what they hear about their accident that they'll start, piecing that together. So, but they don't have the context and the timing and the sequence. There's just these fragmented, like really strong sensory things that are stored. And so as part of their consolidated memories. So I'm wanting to tell you that because also what gets stored is, the connection of, it's dark and there's a truck, I'm driving, it's dark and I get hurt. And so that kind of starts to be, this causes this, causes this. That's the pattern that gets stored. So later, let's say, let's jump ahead a few months. So Mary's okay. She's not hurt that bad, actually. It was more scary than anything. And she just had a short hospital stay, maybe overnight, just because they wanted to observe her, but there were no broken bones, let's say. So physically, she's fine. But let's say a few months later, we visit Mary again, and she didn't drive for a while, but she's starting to drive her car again. But she feels really uneasy when she's doing that. And she actually is avoiding the highway. She always just takes the back roads or through town. She doesn't get on highways anymore because she's so afraid of that, which is what the traumatic, your brain's trying to protect you. If you get back on that highway, this could happen again. You almost died. Your brain is saying, we just about died and that could happen again. So let's say has her windows down again and she's driving through town and she stops at a stoplight and she has some music playing again. A car pulls up behind her and she's thinking about this song or something, and she's right next to let's say a oil, like Grease Monkey, I don't know, like a quick lube shop or something. The light turns green and she's kind of looking around, doesn't notice it, and the car behind her honks. And that loud sound is now paired with the smell of the chemicals like antifreeze and stuff from that store, and her radio's on. And now all of a sudden her that threat system just kicks it in. We're in threat mode again. Her heart jumps, her heart rate spikes, adrenaline goes through her body. So it just starts that whole system again. She's smelling, just a wave of panic comes over her mind, and she has flashbacks of what's happening. And here's what's even worse is that triggers the water level to go up again. So now the prefrontal cortex is a little bit disconnected, and there's a part of your brain in the insula that understands the signals that are going on right now and labels them as this is real or not real, or this is a memory, or this is happening now. And it's underwater too.
It's not
So
available right now
it's not
because of the
available.
reaction.
And so she starts
Yeah.
experiencing her wreck from several months ago as if it's happening right now, and her body can't tell the difference. Even
Yeah.
if even if her on channel could tell, which she's kind of underwater, her body can't. So she starts re-experiencing that trauma. So now think about how, when you do something over and over, how it just gets wired in more and more. And so
Mm-hmm.
she might like pull away from the stoplight because the car is like starting to honk more, like, hurry, we're going to miss this light. So she pulls off to the side of the road because she can't drive. So that's probably a good idea when you're really stressed out. But now you've been avoiding the highway. Now you're avoiding driving. And this avoidance behavior just strengthens the fear because you're not replacing the smell and the horn and the sounds with not getting hurt. You're just letting that loop run that this leads to near death experiences. And so that just gets stronger and stronger, makes it more and more difficult for her to get over that trauma and get through the trauma. So
And
it's
then
more
Mary's not
how,
driving a car at this point. I
yeah,
mean,
she
if
probably will
it,
try to stop driving.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so don't think about trauma as just a memory that's stored that gets pulled up. It's a system of how sensory signals are activated and how they respond and connect, and it becomes this kind of this network response that can be triggered by a smell, or it's usually when multiple things happen at once, like your radio's
I was
on,
just,
the smell, the
okay.
chemicals, the horn honks. That's enough. Like maybe one or two of those isn't enough, but it just sends you into a panic mode and you don't even know why. A lot of times people that are coming through trauma will go, I had a panic attack and I don't even know why. And it's
Mm-hmm.
because the back channel picked up a few signals that said, we're in real danger right here, even though they weren't. Their body and their brain believed that they were in real danger at that time. And you
And
don't even
that,
know.
and that's because of the collection of things of stimuli that,
From
because
the
I was going to
trauma.
ask, um, would, if the same song was playing on the radio, that probably isn't enough to have this response. But if the windows are down, the song and the smell that you added, those three might be enough to trigger this response.
Yeah. And that brings up another interesting point. For some reason, songs are really powerful cues,
Mm-hmm.
more so than other things. But even probably the most powerful is smell, because smell is the only sensory system. So we talked about the high road and the low road, like vision. The high road means that most of the information from your eyes goes on what's called the high road to your visual cortex. So you start to process the visual information so that you're consciously aware of it and understand it.
Mm-hmm.
But the low road goes down to the amygdala and processes things really quickly. Um, the low road goes through from the eyes to the thalamus to the amygdala, and from the ears. The sensory systems go through the thalamus, except for except for smells. They go straight from your nose to the olfactory bulb, and they skip the thalamus, so they go right to the emotional parts of your brain, and they can trigger emotions so fast. And smells are things that we're not really good at identifying, like to describe. Like we can describe visual stuff with in so much detail, but smells are a lot harder to describe. But a smell when you smell it. People will go, oh man, I just caught a whiff of something reminded me of like being at my grandma's when I was a kid, like eating her apple pie or something like that. And you have these
Mm-hmm.
really strong emotional feelings from that, even though you can't describe it real well. And that's because smells go right to the emotional center. But songs also have a really powerful emotional content. So smells can probably trigger trauma faster than most of the other. So, I mean, it depends, but they're really good at that. And songs can as well. But you're
Oh,
right, it usually takes multiple signals before you trigger a full blown
but can I
panic attack.
ask? Let me just make sure I heard that right. We're not talking about smell right now, but smell. So if I smell a certain thing, and maybe you did say it, it's the emotion, but I feel like it triggers a memory. Like I can remember being in my grandparents' cellar beets is a big one because they
Yeah.
used to can beets. It's so
Hmm.
weird to me. But anyway, if I
I
smell
love
beets,
beets, but go ahead.
oh, sorry, I didn't mean to insult you and probably most of our listeners, but when I smell that like earthy, the beets,
Hmm.
the smell I'm talking
And
about.
they, yes, yes.
It transports me immediately back to that memory.
Yeah.
But you were saying it was tied. It skips my memory center.
No, it goes straight to your olfactory bulb, and then it goes to the amygdala and some of the emotional centers of your brain. But those emotional centers are tied to memories,
Two memories.
so
Okay.
it
Okay.
associates that smell with something.
Yes,
So
that
and
makes
think of it
sense.
as like networks of association. It will associate that smell with grandmother, cellars, beets, those types of things.
Okay.
So, but
Okay.
it's a really strong signal. But I think the way to think about it is think about networks of like response networks and of the neurons and the networks. And so each time trauma kind of goes through its loop, it rehearses that network that was wired from that event. It wired some things together, including like this is dangerous. So you're just kind of rehearsing that. So avoiding driving or pulling over to calm down reduces your stress in the moment, but that negatively reinforces avoidance and that prevents new learning. Which, if you have a negative, like a traumatic experience, if you re experience similar situations like driving again and nothing happens, you do that over and over, that creates what's called extinction. So that network kind of gets broken apart. But what your brain is trying to do is it's not just memory, it's more of a predictive model. So the brain tries to predict when you might be in danger. So trauma persists not because it's stuck in memory, so to speak, but because it it was overlearned. It's an overlearned threat protection response that kind of
Yeah.
gets triggered. So you overlearned it because anything that's traumatic, your brain says this is something we have to learn and remember. So that's kind of the overlearning. You didn't that one time you were on the highway and had a wreck shouldn't replace all the other times you had, but that overlearning for that creates this network that persists over time.
So this is answering one of my questions, or maybe the question, in that Mary's event took in all of that relevant information, at least what the non-conscious brain found to be relevant, tied it together. But that it was actually a like a neural pathway that it built.
Yes, yes.
And so there's a physical change in the brain
Hmm.
from that event.
Yes.
And depending on what we do next, it's like a choose your own adventure. I go out on the road and avoid the highway, but have the sights and smells similar. Someone honks at me and I pull off to the side of the road. And then that reinforces that that pattern, or that pathway. I
Pathway.
mean,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
pathway.
Yep.
And then it happens again and again and again. And that pathway becomes strong.
It's really strong. Hmm.
And then I stop driving, and that path, nothing happens to nothing changes that pathway.
Yeah, nothing challenges it. Nothing says
It
this
doesn't
is a
just
bad
go
pathway.
away, right?
Yeah.
It
Hmm.
stays. And so the idea that, like, if I don't drive a car for 3 years, and then maybe that pathway will just fade away, that's not going to happen.
No, it'll probably be stronger than ever.
It'll get stronger, right?
Hmm.
So from this is my question. This is okay. So I've built an actual neural pathway through this
Hmm.
thing, and one of the best ways, because we're going to talk about, maybe I have some questions about some other ways, but one of the best ways is to be out on the highway and have nothing happen enough times that there was a word that you used, but that pathway gets
Extinction.
extinction. Okay,
Extinction. You
so
get rid of the pathway. You
and
kind
then
of overlearn it in a positive way.
okay, and then that over time, once I've that pathway has become extinct, it's replaced with a new pathway, which is I've been on this highway 100 times and nothing's happened.
We're safe to drive now. We can drive on the highway safely. It's kind of the pathway. You don't get, there's not a panic attack when you're on the highway.
Right.
Yeah. Because the
So
brain doesn't predict that it's going to be a crash.
There's this sense of, 5 years ago I got into this vehicle collision or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just kind of like a story I tell, or I don't want to call it a memory, but it's a memory.
Yeah, no, it is.
It's a memory, but I don't have the panic. I don't have the reaction to any of these things anymore because I've created a new pathway, and that old pathway's gone.
Right. And so I think I might have overdone the memory thing. I want you to think of memory, and the listeners to think of memory not as a file cabinet, but as a pathway. There's connections that get there's neural networks that are connected and associated, and that becomes a pathway, and that's your memory, so to speak, is that pathway. So when you remember something, you run back through that pathway to remember it. So it's just that now that pathway is just infused with trauma. So ways to treat it. You're right. If you start driving and just drive for several months on the highway, nothing happens, then that's helping. That's called extinction learning. So you're learning that trauma isn't the way things normally happen, but that can be really tough to do. That can be hard to get back on the road. So you're asking, depending on how bad it traumatized you, some people can get right back in the car and start driving and think, wow, that was a one-off. And other people, it's just shakes them. And that's for a car wreck. But when you think of like PTSD or something, you can't always go right back on the battlefield if it happened when you were in the military or whatever.
Right.
So there's other ways to do it. And there's like what's called exposure therapy. And that's where you are in a safe environment with a therapist, with a professional, and they start exposing you little by little to the trauma and say, just think, you can sit here. They teach them skills like deep breathing, through the nose to keep your heart rate down, and to start letting you know that it's safe to think about this. Another way is through narrative therapy, I think it's called, something like narrative therapy, where it's saying one of the issues is, the hippocampus never got to consolidate the memory of the event. It's just all these sensory flashes that it stored. So as to think back and talk about the event and think through what happened and why and how it could have happened. And if you start creating that narrative around it, that kind of expands those pathways to associate with other things, and it weakens the center line trauma part of the pathway. It weakens that part, so that can help. And then, there's pharmaceuticals that can help, like SSRIs, the serotonin reuptake inhibitor, and exercise, good sleep, those types of things can also help. But eventually, Mary, if she gets help in one of those ways, it might be that several months after that, she's driving again and stops and smells like next to a lube shop and gets those smells, and there might be a little bit of unease, but her brain's going, okay, that's unpleasant, but I realize that's not dangerous. So it doesn't trigger this full-blown panic attack. It's like, I don't like that smell that well. And that's okay to always have that feeling of, I don't really like the smell of antifreeze now. But you understand it's because of the wreck, and that's okay. It's like you don't have to get rid of every memory of a trauma. It's just that you can live with it now, and it doesn't drag you down and put you in full panic mode. And that would be the goal.
Yeah. So that was an in-depth description of acute trauma.
Yeah.
But what about, from the information you've given me, I can imagine what it's going to be like with chronic trauma.
Yeah. Because it's not like you're in a wreck on the highway every week.
Right.
So yeah. So when you're talking more about chronic trauma, that usually involves traumatic experiences with other people, for example, like other people causing you trauma. So you're in a situation, you're stuck in that situation. So let's say that, for this example, let's say there's an 8-year-old boy, and instead of giving this boy, and let's just call this person Kid. So this is a kid, but let's just say this person's name is Kid. So kid is 8 years old, let's say, and he's staying at and he's from a loving family, and he loves his grandmother, and his uncle lives at that house. He loves his uncle. So he's staying at his grandmother's house. And one evening, his uncle, who he trusts and loves his uncle, he comes into his bedroom at night when everybody else is asleep and sexually abuses him. And then afterwards, he threatens him and says, if you tell anybody, I'll hurt your mother really, really bad. This is our secret. Don't you ever tell anybody. So now you think about, okay, now that we kind of know what the brain is doing, it's creating these sensory snapshots. It can be the smell of his uncle's cologne. So let's say it has, I don't know what to say, like a spicy or a woody scent. Let's just say it's kind of a woody smell. The sound of footsteps creaking on the hallway floorboards is like, oh, that becomes like something that the brain captures, because it's trying to say, I've got to capture all the important parts. And then the non-conscious brain isn't logical and reasonable like the on channel, the conscious brain, that would say, actually some of these things don't have anything to do with what happened. The back channel, the non-conscious brain, tries to record everything so that it can avoid this. Maybe a little bit of dim light coming under the doorway, the feeling of maybe the texture of the bedspread when he's gripping it in his fist really tight, the quiet voice, or the uncle, the smell of his breath or something, or just the weight of sitting on the bed, how it shifts your body, or like the sound of the door clicking shut, or the feeling of pressure and pain. It can even, this is why, like, trauma with other individuals involved is even so much more complex and advanced, because it can be like what can also be frozen in there is that the house is quiet and nobody's coming to help me. Like, just that sense of aloneness is now gets captured. The racing heart. So all of those things, you can think of 1,000 more things, I'm sure. So that's what gets locked in. And then if you think, the survival part of the brain, you've heard of the fight, flight, freeze system. So now that all of a sudden you think, oh, my uncle's coming, I wonder what's happening. And then you realize that something bad is happening. And, the amygdala and the threat system just dumps adrenaline and everything in your body to try to avoid the trauma. And you realize this 8-year-old, kid realizes he can't fight his uncle. His uncle's so much bigger. He can't run because the door's shut and it's dark and his uncle could catch him before he got to the door. Like, what's left is that freeze. And so a lot of times, victims of abuse and sexual abuse will go into what's called tonic immobility, where their muscles just tense up and won't hardly move. You can't even hardly move their arms, and they just like lock into this really rigid position, because that's kind of a primitive response for survival. If you can't escape, your body just locks up, and a lot of times you black out and you become unconscious. And so that's just like, I can't get away. I've just got to try to just freeze and survive this. And when it happens over and over, sometimes individuals will start disassociating themselves during those moments. So they'll say, like, I'm not Jonathan. That didn't happen to Jonathan. That happened to Joe Nathan, or so. Like, it's like almost a different personality, because I'm not going to take that trauma on. That was somebody else that lived through that trauma, and so they disassociate themselves in that way. So, and then the hippocampus doesn't process this as a memory. It's just these fragments and bits and pieces, and a lot of times victims struggle to remember the trauma, and that's because, maybe thankfully, the on channel was underwater and they can't form this narrative story, so they just get these. And so these highly fragmented memories also include, the emotional sensory memories also include some, like, devastating core beliefs get attached to that, like, I'm not safe anywhere. Like, I'm not safe in if you're not safe in your grandma's house, like, where are you safe? So, like, I'm not safe. It goes, I can't trust anybody. I love my uncle and trust. I can't trust anybody. Another one might be, my body's not mine. I'm powerless. If I tell someone I love is going to be hurt. So all of these start to get wired in, especially when you're young, like 8 years old. It's so hard to process through all that stuff. So now let's say that this happens a few times, and now kid is older, maybe kid's in his you know 20s or something, and he's trying to have a relationship with another person, and now maybe they're in the bedroom getting ready for an intimate experience, and they're like the smell of a similar, like a woody smell of a cologne comes up, or the floor squeaks just right, or the bed, the pressure on the
You
bed
said the
along with the
light from
smell,
under the door
the light
with
from
the
under the
bed
door.
moving a certain way,
Yeah.
and add a third variable that into this.
Yeah, and so now kid just like freezes, like that tonic immobility where he does, and like sweating,
Yeah.
adrenaline floods his system. And now remember, the insula, who usually says no, that's a memory. It's like it's not sending that signal that that's a memory. So the brain and the body is experiencing this as if the trauma is happening again,
We are under
and
threat right now.
under threat, sweating,
Right.
and then the partner's like, "Whoa, what's happening?" Backs up. Now you add on top of that the feeling of shame and confusion because now this person's going, "Whoa, what's just happened?" Now I don't know what happened. Like, what's wrong with me? I don't know what just happened. Like, are you okay? Do you want, do you not like me? And so then there's this confusion, shame. There's so many parts that get added into trauma when it's in relationships that's different from acute trauma from a car wreck.
Right.
Like these
Right.
are, now you're dealing with, I don't want to go out. I just want to stay at home. I don't want to trust anybody. There's no social friendships anymore. And just the sensory triggers can be so strong. A smell, a touch, a sound can trigger that. Um, the emotional state gets reactivated, like terror and helplessness. The physiological responses like freezing, dissociations, that brings back cognitive stuff like I'm not safe, I'm trapped, I don't own my own body. People close to me are betraying me. There's just so much added into it that's so difficult.
So going back to the acute trauma you described, and like I said before we started this part, is that I thought I would have a similar answer, but there's a pathway that's built, right? So the first um, situation of abuse, all of those sight, sound, smells, all of that stuff gets wired, and then if it happens again and again and again, that pathway gets strengthened, I guess, strengthened.
Yeah,
Uh,
strength. Yeah.
uh, um, and then very similar to probably what we talked about with acute, but um, the ways to make that pathway extinct is, I'm assuming, therapy.
That's a good start. Yeah.
Well, because I mean,
It's almost impossible without it. Yeah.
with the car wreck, we were talking about get out on the highway and train your brain that there's no get out on the highway here.
Nope. No,
And
there's not.
and so then also though, you talked about like disassociating yourself from the event,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm assuming that further complicates
Mm-hmm.
consolidation of any kind of memory or anything. So when you go to can you just, I mean, talk about how do you treat, what's therapy like here in an
Yeah.
extreme case?
Yeah. And right before we go to therapy, I wanted to also say we were talking about like three different things can trigger it, like a sight, a smell. It doesn't have to be those three sensory things. It could be like a smell, like that woody cologne smell,
Mm-hmm.
with I'm in an intimate setting, like the context is intimate because I'm in the bedroom and there's physical closeness. Like it can be those that can say, oh, that all adds up to danger. So
Okay.
it doesn't
Okay.
have to be the creaking floor and light. It can be just like I'm in a situation, like an intimate situation, and a person is really close to me, and I see a light under the door or something like that. But
Right, right,
yeah, and but anyway, so for the therapy part of this, this is the good news out of all this is you see how fast the brain can wire itself and rewire itself. It's called plasticity. And so the brain's plastic and can change. And that's the good news, because therapy can do that too. But it does. This isn't a case where you get back on the highway and drive and you're okay. You have to
right.
have a plan, and you have to have a professional really helping you through this plan. So, being in a safe space, understanding that you're safe and that nothing's going to happen, and you can talk about things, so there's no shame and embarrassment, because everything can be open, and it's up to the therapist to kind of build that, and therapists are really good at building those types of things. So now I feel safe. And one of the issues that people struggle with is vulnerability. I don't want to ever be vulnerable. I don't want to be around people because I'm vulnerable. I don't want to talk about things that are uncomfortable because that makes me vulnerable. So therapists have a pretty high hurdle to overcome sometimes, and it might take a little bit before kid allows the therapist becomes vulnerable in front of the therapist. But once kid starts doing that, and the therapist is helping kid by saying, there's usually a lot of guilt, like that was my fault, I shouldn't have been there for my uncle to be. No, that's that other person's fault. It's not your fault. They're
Right.
the ones that are broken, not you. So let's talk about you're broken too. I should say they're the problem. They're the ones that broke you. Let's put you back
Yeah.
together.
You're the
So
result of that person's behavior. You
exactly.
didn't do anything to deserve any of this.
I love that
But
Lucinda Williams song, like broken butterflies. Like there's so many butterflies that just get broken, because especially with children. That's why,
yeah,
as a society, we want to protect children, which is really good, but children are also really weak and vulnerable. And so
vulnerable.
people can prey on them so easily. That's why I think we have to do so much to protect children. That should be something that as a society we prioritize.
Yeah. And again, I realized it as I was saying it, uh, saying therapy and all of that. It's like this kid in his
Hmm.
20s
Hmm.
who maybe has this experience in his college dorm or whatever, wherever.
Yeah. Yep.
But, I don't know that therapy is always like the first thing. Hey, I should go to therapy because of what you're saying, right? There's guilt and shame
There's
and
also
all
a
of
stigma
these.
around it. Like,
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
Americans. We pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. I can do this myself. I don't need help. Like, if I
right.
need help, that means I'm weak. So, yeah, there's so much stigma, and yeah,
Yeah.
it's
And
not
I
what people
don't
think of first.
know is, oh, I need to go to therapy.
Yeah, and
Uh,
it's so helpful. It's
but
necessary. And
short of therapy, there's really no way to address an actual neural pathway that's been built in your brain that will not go away by just ignoring it. Like
right.
the idea that I will never be in an intimate situation with another human being.
Hmm.
And if I do that, this pathway will become extinct.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work that way.
Mm-mm. No,
It's
it's
and
the
again,
opposite.
I know they are
It,
very different situations, and I'm not comparing the two, but it's somewhat equivalent to not driving a car again.
yeah.
Only in that it will not solve it doesn't do anything to that pathway that's been built.
No, and one thing I didn't mention earlier, that exacerbates or makes it worse, is you wall yourself off, and you don't want to be out in public. You don't want to be vulnerable, so you stay in your home. And now, guess what you're doing? A lot of the times, you're thinking and kind of going over all those things in your mind, and that's just when you replay something, you're strengthening that pathway.
Oh
So now
yeah,
you're thinking about the trauma, and that's just reinforcing that trauma, which makes it even harder to get out of the house and go meet people and become vulnerable and that type of thing. It makes it, yeah, because your brain is saying, I can't trust people. People are dangerous. I can't trust anybody. I don't, and especially people who've been through a lot of trauma don't understand how to set boundaries, for example, with other people, and they're just used. People just run over them. They're in work settings where they won't stand up for themselves, and their boss says, "Hey, can you get a report to me?" But they go, "Okay," and knowing that they can't, but they can't say no. You've already given me this other project, and I can't do it. They can't say no, There's just there's so many kind of peripheral things that go along with trauma that you can't even really describe it all. And the person that's had this happen to them don't even most of the time don't see the connections to all these other issues they're dealing with, how it can connect back to trauma. It's just like, see, I'm a failure. Look, I can't even get this report done by
Mm-hmm.
Monday. And they don't realize, because they don't feel like their own person and they never learned to set boundaries because they couldn't set a boundary. Kid couldn't set a boundary with his uncle, that now I can't set boundaries. And this goes back to this childhood trauma. They don't see that and tie that together, and they need help seeing those things, and therapists can help with those types of things.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that we've come a long way culturally, at least in this country.
Mm-hmm. I
But I still
agree.
think
I
there's
agree.
this stigma with therapy.
It really is.
I think we've gotten a little bit better, but I still see it and hear it of like, I'm not going to pay money just to talk to somebody or whatever the negative thing is. I would just say this, out of all of this, is if you have the ability and you've been through any kind of trauma, don't minimize it.
Mm-mm.
Try it. Just try therapy. Go to a couple of sessions. Try a couple of therapists out.
Mm-hmm.
From people in my life that go to therapy, I don't. I'll be upfront about it. I don't go to therapy, but I've only heard positive results
Mm-hmm.
about
Yeah.
it, and again, going to someone who's a professional who can help you work through, and it doesn't only have to be trauma. I know we're talking about trauma right
Mm-hmm.
now, but it can be a lot of things. It can be a very positive experience in your life. Go talk to somebody.
Yeah. And then I would say, if you think about a doctor, like your family doctor, medical doctor, that you go get checkups, you can go to a doctor and find out they really don't know what they're talking about, and they're not a good doctor. And then you get a different doctor, right? So if you're
Hmm.
going to, it's a little bit harder with therapy because a lot of people haven't been to a therapist, but they've been to a doctor. So they know that if they don't like their doctor, they can get a different one. And when you go to a therapist, if you have a negative experience, you just tend to say, see, I knew it. And you don't go back, or you stay with that therapist thinking it'll be like this all the time. And then, maybe even there's a little bit more damage caused. So I would just say, absolutely go see a therapist. And if in the first couple times you meet with them, things just aren't clicking and you're not feeling like this, try a different one, just like trying a different doctor,
Yeah.
like a second opinion type thing. And really good therapists tell you that right at the beginning. Like, therapy is a relationship, and we both have to feel comfortable with each other, because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about things that are intimate, and we have to trust each other. And if it's not working out for you or for me, then we need to part ways, because more damage can be caused. So
Yeah.
let's just agree right up front, we're going to try this out for 1 or 2 sessions and see if we want to continue. Good therapists will maybe not say it in those exact words, but they'll tell you that if you're not comfortable and don't think things are working, to go seek a different therapist, because there's enough people with problems that every therapist has work. So it's, you've got to find
Yeah.
what's best for you, but definitely seek somebody out.
I just realized, I don't know why it just hit me, but like the idea of having to go to a therapist's office is a little even becoming outdated. They have Zoom calls.
It's a lot of it's online. Yeah.
Yeah, you can do. There's a whole bunch of service. Well, maybe not a whole bunch, but there's several services that you can sign up for, and they help you find a therapist, and then
Mm-hmm.
also give you the opportunity, if you don't hit it off with that therapist, to find a different one within their
Absolutely.
same network. So that
That is true.
we're slowly removing some of the barriers
Mm-hmm.
to entry into therapy for people. So.
Yeah. And so I think there's a little bit of a drawback, because sometimes that face to face encounter can be really good where you're in the same room.
Mm,
But I think the
mm.
benefits are what you're mentioning. It lowers, I don't have to leave my house. I don't
Mm-hmm.
have to go into an office and meet somebody new. I can, if I don't like somebody, it's easier to switch because it's just they're on
Mm-hmm.
the screen. I mean, there's so many benefits to it, and yeah, you may miss that face to face, but there's a lot of other benefits. And if you really want the face to face, like if you start therapy online, so to speak, through Zoom calls or whatever, and you see that it's helping, but you want the face to face, then seek out. That therapist will probably help you find one in your area, because therapists practice different types of therapy, and some types of therapy work better for trauma, while others work better for losing weight or what. There's different things you can
Mm-hmm.
do, and most therapists will use various techniques. But it might be that that person says, hey, yeah, if you're wanting to go find and meet face to face, be sure that you're looking for a therapist that does this type of therapy, and so they can help guide you in the right way. But
If I'm going to do therapy, John, I want face to face, because I want to lay on a couch
yes,
with a dude who has a pipe and
a
the
notebook.
sweater, the yellow legal pad sweater with the elbow pad, or what are
Yeah, patches, a
the
patch on the
patches on
elbow.
the elbows. I got it all mapped out. Like, that's my schema for therapy, and it's got to fit that for
You
this to
want him
work.
to write a lot, but at the right times. There are certain times you don't
Correct.
want him to be taking notes. Then you're like, oh
If
wait,
I'm there and I go,
yeah,
"What are you writing?
yeah.
Why'd you write something down then? What did I say?" Oh, John, I have kept you way longer than I intended to, but as
No,
always,
I think this was
that was
good. Yeah, and I
so
hope
good.
people realize that it's about the neural pathways and associations that are made that get locked in, and it's about finding a way to unlock those, or to break those apart. And it's not just about being tough or just don't think about it or forget it. It's like sometimes you need help when it's trauma. But just also know that's how memories work in general. That's how our brain is built to help us survive, because if you go to a certain area and you just think back, and these are cavemen or whatever, and they go to an area where they could get hurt, they want to avoid that. And so it's there for a purpose. The way our brain works is there for a purpose. But we now have the ability, the knowledge, the know-how, the years of practice of all of this to help people get through trauma and things. So it's your brain protects you, but sometimes it can be overprotective, but it's plastic and it can change. You just need to seek a professional to help with that.
Yeah, yeah. That was so educational for me. I got way more out of it than I was even asking for, which I always appreciate.
Good. I'm
So
glad. I'm
thank
glad.
you,
Yep.
thank you. And I think I don't want to overdo it, but I would say, if you listen to this and you know somebody, you have somebody in your life, or it's you, um, avoidance, when we're talking about trauma, avoidance doesn't work. The hardest part is we have to deal with the trauma.
Yep.
So, we've already laid out some of the steps. Find a therapist, go to one of the companies, online, or whatever you can do. You can't hide from trauma as much as I'd like to believe we can. You can't do it. So,
True.
John, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks,
Everybody
Sean.
out there, thank you. And until next week, take care of yourself, and we'll see you then.
Grain to Sean.